Welcome to my channel, detailing events throughout the decades. 1972, the Andes plane crash. In Uruguay, the Old Christians, an amateur rugby team, charters a flight to a match in Santiago, Chile. This was Air Force Flight 571. They were told at the time that there were still 10 seats available on the flight, so the team decided to invite family and friends to fill these seats. They had been told that they could fill these seats for free. One of the team players, Nando Parada, had brought with him his mother and sister. Their trip was scheduled to be from Thursday to Monday. They left on Thursday, October 12th, but the weather wasn't good, so Flight 571 landed in Mendoza to wait for the weather to improve. They all slept there overnight. They boarded the plane again on Friday, October 13th. The pilots had flown across the Andes at least 29 times before. The Fairchild FH-227 aircraft was known for being underpowered amongst pilots. 23 Fairchilds had crashed already before the Andes crash. The plane took off, and the captain chose to fly south and make a turn towards the Planquillo Impasse and turn towards the Andes. This itself created problems. The Andes were well known for creating storms, which could be very fierce. The Fairchild was expected to arrive at Curacao at 3:33 p.m., but the pilots reported they were over Curacao at 3:24 p.m. It took 11 minutes to cover this area, but it took the Fairchild just 3 minutes. The Fairchild were not where the pilots thought they were. It is unclear as to why the pilot had made such a big mistake, which then cost some of those on board their life. The Fairchild started to experience turbulence on board the plane, and the passengers put on their seat belts. The plane started to shake violently. They came out of the cloud cover and realized they were now surrounded by mountains, and were not where they expected to be. The pilots accelerated to try and climb above the mountains, but by now it was too late. The fuselage plane hit the mountains and the tail tore off. The fuselage slid down the snowy slope, and luckily did not hit anything on its way down. It was 3:32 p.m. when the plane crashed. 12 are killed in the initial crash. "33 survived the initial crash, but are critically wounded, including Nando and Susana Paradu. The plane comes to rest on an elevation around 11,800 feet. Most of those on board have never seen snow before. Nando was injured with a brain injury, and the other survivors move his body near the outside of the fuselage, making space inside for the other survivors. The co-pilot was still alive, but he was in a great deal of pain. He asked the survivors to bring him his revolver so he could end his life. He was trapped inside the cockpit with no way to get out. He was still convinced even then that they had been where they were supposed to be. The plane had never passed Curacao, Chile, but had crashed in Argentina. The location was so remote that many of the mountains surrounding the crash site were not even named. The survivors got extra clothing out of the suitcases to try and keep warm. The first night, the temperatures go down to -30 degrees. They used luggage and seats to try and close off the open end of the fuselage. 27 people crammed into the crashed plane. 5 more people would die that first night. Day 2. The survivors are expected to be rescued, but because the fuselage was white, it was never spotted by the aircraft flying overhead. The survivors begin to move the dead bodies outside to give them more space inside. They did not have much food, which they had to ration. The food only lasted a few days. Nando Paradu, who was presumed dead and moved outside the fuselage, begins to move. Moving him out into the cold saved his life, and helped protect his brain injury. He asks about his mother and sister. He is told the sad news that his mother has died in the crash and his sister is injured. There was nothing around them to give them any kind of food source. They waited days to be rescued, but it never happened. The rescuers flew over the crash site, but never spotted them. Day 7. That night, Nando's sister loses her fight for life and dies in his arms. Day 10. 27 survivors still remain. They listen to a small transistor radio. All hope is suddenly lost as they learn that the rescue has been called off. No help is coming. All food has run out by now, and the thoughts of eating the dead start to emerge. They wanted to survive. They collect water by bending metal seat backs into funnels and melting the snow in the sun, and collecting the water in empty wine bottles. They now start to consider eating the flesh off those who had died in order to keep alive. They construct cutting tools, to cut the flesh. This was the hardest decision they had to make. 10 days after the initial crash, the first body was cut. They didn't really have a fire for cooking, so the flesh had to be consumed raw. It is hard to imagine what they must have been feeling at this time. Their will to live was very strong, and they consumed different parts of the body. They all made a pact with each other, that if any of them died, they could use their body as food. They wanted at least someone to survive and tell of the crash. Day 18. 27 are still alive. Avalanches are a common thing in the Andes Mountains, and it is estimated that around 250,000 avalanches occur in the Andes each year. While they were all asleep, an avalanche hit the fuselage. Those inside were buried alive in the snow. Those who did manage to get out, tried desperately to dig out their friends. Sadly, more people would die that night. Only 19 survivors remain. The plane is now covered in snow and those inside are fast running out of air. They thought that they were going to die there. A pole was found and used to make a hole in the top of the fuselage to get extra air. After 3 days trapped, the survivors managed to tunnel their way out of the fuselage. Over the next few weeks, the fuselage begins to re-emerge out of the snow as it begins to melt. Some of the survivors tried to venture away from the fuselage seeking help, but soon returned. The depth of the snow at the crash site was up to 100 feet. It almost seemed impossible. They were trying to search for the tail of the plane. They suffered from snow blindness and didn't have sunglasses to stop this. They had to adapt to their surroundings and build essential items out of what they had. Snowshoes were made out of seat belt straps and seat cushions. November. 1 month after the crash. Nando and another survivor try to search for the tail section, which they did eventually find. They found a camera and started taking pictures for someone to find. They were hoping that if they died, and the camera was found, it would prove that there had been survivors of the crash. Arturo Noguera had suffered a leg wound in the crash, and now had gangrene. He knew he was going to die, which he did that night. 3 days later, Rafael Echeverren also died of infection from his wounds. Survivor, Numa Turcati starts to detest the taste of human flesh and decides to stop eating, even though he knew this was going to be the end for him. December. It has now been 2 months since the crash and only 16 of the passengers remain alive. Many of the bodies have been eaten, and only a few more bodies remain, including Nando's sister and mother. They knew they needed to try and find help in Chile. To the west is 15,000-foot mountains which block their way. They are unaware of exactly where they are, and what they didn't know at the time, if they traveled east of where they were, 18 miles from them was a hotel. However, they would have had to cross a huge river, so it is unknown if they would have even made it to the hotel. Day 60. Nando was eager to get out of there and see his father again. He needed him to know he hadn't lost all of his family. Aircraft insulation was used to help keep the body warm in the extreme temperature which those trying to look for help needed. A sleeping bag was made. On December 12th, the three going to find help had a break in the weather, so set out on their long journey. It was 61 days since the crash. The three survivors carry a 3-day ration of human flesh, packed within a sock. They thought that this was going to be enough. They begin climbing the mountain. They had no experience with altitude, so really struggled with this. They had to make a bed for the night on the mountain. They thought they would have been able to climb this mountain in a day, but it took them 3 days to climb. Near the summit, Roberto spots what he thinks is a road. They thought when they reached the top and looked over the mountains they would see the green valley of Chile. All they saw was miles of mountains. They now begin to think they are going to die there, but decide to carry on and die trying if they had to. Nando and the other two have now spent 3 days climbing their first mountain, which was a 15,000-foot peak to the west. They continue to travel west. The supply of flesh is starting to run out. After 3 days, one of those who had ventured out, decided to return back to the others. He managed to slide down the mountain and went back to tell the others what they had found. Nando and Roberto saw 2 peaks in the distance which did not have snow on top. These peaks were actually 80 miles away. They continued to struggle on, and knew that going back would lead to death, and no one coming for the others. Roberto Canasa is stricken with dysentery, which left untreated, can be fatal. The urgent need to be rescued now grows more critical each day. Over 10 days and nights of trekking, Nando and Roberto had trekked 40 miles through unforgiving terrain in the Andes. Day 70. All of a sudden, they saw a man on a horse across a huge river. It was a Chilean rancher. They began shouting, but because of the noise of the river, they could not hear one another. This was a glint of hope. The rancher put a piece of paper and pencil around a rock and threw it across the river. They wrote a message about the plane crash and the other survivors needed rescue. They were still unsure of where they actually were at this point. They threw the rock back to the rancher. He then threw back over some bread and cheese, which was the first substantive food they had tasted for over 2 months. He went to get help, which took around 10 hours. He brought back with him some military men who helped them out of the Andes. The media soon found out about the survivors and wanted to talk to Roberto and Nando. At the crash site, the survivors hear on the radio that Nando and Roberto have been found. At this point, they knew help would come for them. 72 days. Helicopters went to the crash site. Even now, it was still very hard for them to see the fuselage against the snow. 3 were taken off the Andes that day. Early the next morning, all the remaining survivors were transported back to safety. Now came the task for those families who had found out there were survivors from Flight 571 to know if their family member was one of those to survive. On December 23, news reported worldwide about the cannibalism. Survivors held a press conference on December 25 where they recounted the events of the 72 days. The authorities and families decided to bury the remains of those who died near the crash site in a common grave. 13 bodies were untouched, but 15 bodies were mostly bone. They were buried on January 18, 1973. A plaque is placed on the pile of rocks. The remains of the fuselage was doused in gasoline and set on fire. The crash location attracts hundreds each year wanting to pay tribute to the victims and survivors. The story of the crash is described in the Andes Museum 1972, which was dedicated in 2013 in Ciudad Vieja, Montevideo. The 16 survivors remain very close today, and have a reunion each year. Forever remembering those who died in the Andes. May you never be forgotten. Thank you for watching and learning about events throughout history. Please subscribe to my channel to view other events throughout the decades.